This man is about to lose everything. His swords, his status, his entire way of life. Within a few years of this photograph being taken, the Japanese government would ban the samurai class, strip their income, and outlaw the weapons they had carried for 800 years. These are the lost photographs of Japan's last samurai. Not paintings, not recreations, real images taken by one of the first cameras to ever enter the country. Every person in these photos was living through the final years of a world that had existed for centuries and was about to be destroyed. But to understand why these photos exist at all, you need to know what happened when Japan opened its doors for the first time in 250 years. For 250 years, Japan sealed itself from the world. Starting in the 1630s, the Tokugawa shogunate closed nearly every port, expelled almost all foreigners, and made it a crime punishable by death for any Japanese citizen to leave the country or for any outsider to enter. Only a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki harbor, a place called Dejima, allowed a handful of Dutch traders to operate under heavy restrictions. That was it, one island for a quarter of a millennium. For the West, Japan became a ghost, a civilization whispered about in travelers' journals but never seen. Nobody knew what was behind those closed borders. And then, in 1853, everything changed. American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed 4 warships into Edo Bay and demanded Japan open its ports to trade. The Japanese had never seen steam-powered warships before. They called them the Black Ships. The message was clear: open your borders or we'll open them for you. Japan had no navy capable of resisting. Within a year they signed treaties. Within a decade, the ports of Yokohama, Nagasaki and Kobe were flooded with Western merchants, diplomats and photographers. Among them was a man named Felice Beato, an Italian-British photographer who had already documented the Crimean War, the Indian Rebellion, and the Second Opium War in China. He arrived in Yokohama in 1863, and what he found was a civilization that looked like it had stepped out of the medieval world. Samurai walked the street in full armor. Women in elaborate kimonos filled the tea houses. Temples and shrines stood unchanged for centuries. Japan in 1860s looked nothing like anywhere else on Earth. Beato was mesmerized. He set up a studio and began photographing everything. Samurai warriors, geisha, street vendors, temples, rice farmers, sword makers, and because this was the 1860s, he hired Japanese artists, former woodblock printmakers, to hand-color every photograph with watercolor paint. The results were unlike anything the world had ever seen. But here's what makes these photos different from every other old photograph you've ever seen. The people in them didn't know the world was ending. Every samurai posing in these images believed his class would exist forever. Every geisha, every merchant, every swordsmith, they had no idea that in just a few years, the government would erase their entire way of life. Look at this photograph. This is a real samurai, photographed by Beato sometime in the mid-1860s. He's wearing traditional armor that had been passed down through generations. The design of the helmet, the lacework of the chest plate, this wasn't ceremonial. This was battle gear worn by a class of warriors who had dominated Japan since the 12th century. And this, a group of samurai retainers. Notice the swords. Every samurai carried 2, a long katana and a shorter wakizashi. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a legal privilege. Only samurai were permitted to carry swords in public. It was the single most visible symbol of their status. But it wasn't just warriors. Beato captured an entire world, tea ceremony preparations, women in layered kimonos walking through temple gardens, street merchants selling fish on roads that hadn't changed in 3 centuries. Even the architecture, wooden homes and paper screen walls feel the same way they had been for hundreds of years. These hand-colored photographs are almost impossibly beautiful. The artists Beato hired were so precise that they painted individual fingernails, flower petals and fabric patterns onto the images. The result sits somewhere between a photograph and a painting, and every single one of them captures a moment that was about to disappear. Because while Beato was photographing this world, a revolution was already destroying it. In 1876, two final blows fell. First, the government forcibly converted samurais' annual rice stipends into government bonds worth a fraction of their original value. Warriors who had been paid for generations were now told to find their jobs. Then came the sword ban, the Haiterai edict. For the first time in centuries, samurai were forbidden from wearing their swords in public. Think about what that means. Take another look at these photographs of samurai posing with their katanas. Those swords weren't just weapons. They were the samurai's identity, their legal privilege, the symbol of everything they were. And in one government decree, it was taken away. Some samurai cut off their top knots and adopted Western suits. They became businessmen, teachers, and police officers. But not all of them accepted this quietly. In 1877, a man named Saigo Takamori led 30,000 former samurai in one final rebellion against the new government. He was one of the most respected warriors in Japan. He had actually helped create the Meiji government just 9 years earlier, but he believed the reforms had gone too far, that the soul of Japan was being sold to the West. His army marched north with the swords and outdated rifles. They were met by Japan's new conscript army, peasant soldiers equipped with modern Western weapons. The war lasted 8 months, and on September 24th, 1877, Saigo Takamori and his last 300 samurai charged uphill into artillery fire at a place called Shiroyama. Saigo was wounded and, following samurai tradition, took his own life. He was the last. After Shiroyama, there were no more samurai rebellions. The warrior class that had shaped Japan for 8 centuries was finished. Now look at these photographs again. That samurai in full armor. By the time his photograph was widely circulated, his class had been legally dissolved. Those swords he's carrying, banned, the system that gave him status, income, and purpose already gone. Felice Beato didn't just take photographs, he accidentally created a record of a world's last breath. Every image is a before picture, and the after was erasure. Japan today is one of the most technologically advanced nations on Earth. Bullet trains, skyscrapers, robots, but hidden underneath all of it are the ghosts of a feudal world that existed for centuries and vanished in barely a decade. These photos are the only proof that the world was real. The men and women in these photographs didn't pose for history, they posed for a camera they barely understood, in a world that they thought would last forever, and it didn't. If you want to see more lost photographs from civilizations that no longer exist, watch this next.